how on earth did this happen?
This is an extraordinary, potentially dangerous, and without a doubt embarrassing breach of national security.
A journalist was inadvertently included on a text message chain in which the president's national security team was planning an attack on Yemen's Houthi rebels.
Then, on the day of the attack, with the journalist still included in the text message chain, the Secretary of Defense spelled out exactly how it would play out 2 hours before it did.
This all happened on an encrypted text messaging service called Signal, which is not approved for sharing classified information.
Ed O'Keefe is at the White House with more about the security breach and the president's reaction tonight. Ed?
Good evening. The senior officials on the group text debated whether or not the U.S. should strike Houthi targets and swap details of the airstrikes. The details so sensitive, the reporter who accidentally received it all opted not to publish them out of concern for national security. The U.S. bombed Houthi rebel positions in Yemen on March 15th in response to the group's continued attacks on commercial shipping vessels in the Red Sea and missile strikes against Israel. The classified details of the U.S. attack plans were first shared 2 days earlier with Jeffrey Goldberg, editor-in-chief of The Atlantic magazine. He'd been added, accidentally, to a group chat of senior administration officials on Signal, invited by National Security Advisor Michael Waltz.
I've never heard of anything quite like this.
In all, 18 people were in the chat, including Vice President Vance, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and National Intelligence Director Tulsi Gabbard.
People have devices that are extraordinarily convenient, and government officials are just like you and me. They like convenience. They're just like you and me. They sometimes send text to people they didn't mean to send text to. The consequences here are a lot higher for that sort of thing than in regular civilian life.
Goldberg watched on his phone as the group debated striking the Houthis. And then, on the morning of the attacks, Hegseth shared operational details about the forthcoming strike, including the timing, the targets, and the types of weapons used. Once the strikes concluded, the group exchanged emojis in celebration, flames, fist bumps, and American flags. Sharing top-secret details over Signal likely violated the Espionage Act, according to CBS News national security consultant Sam Vinograd.
Operational plans related to the Houthis and strikes in Yemen more than likely are classified or at least operationally sensitive. So it'll be important to see whether the Department of Justice opens up an investigation into a potential leak of classified information.
Goldberg's article first published on Monday while the president was holding a cabinet meeting with most of the people on the text group.
I don't know anything about it. I'm not a big fan of The Atlantic. To me, it's a magazine that's going out of business. I think it's not much of a magazine.
And Ed O'Keefe joins us now from the White House. Ed, what's the White House saying behind the scenes?
The press secretary says tonight, John, that the president has the utmost confidence in his national security team, including National Security Advisor Michael Waltz, whose office admits Jeffrey Goldberg shouldn't have been on the text chain.
Ed, you've covered the White House for several years now. Have you ever seen a lapse like this? I mean, how big a deal are we talking about here?
Oh, this is a big deal, Maurice, because this is the kind of internal conversation that normally happens in the basement behind thick doors in the Situation Room, far away from reporters ever go. And the reason they happen in a room like that is so that they can be protected from foreign interference or spies. And that's what has Democrats, Republicans, and intelligence officials in this town and across the country concerned, that if they're discussing this kind of information in an unclassified setting, what else might they be discussing?
Ed O'Keefe at the White House. Thank you, Ed.
National security correspondent Charlie D'Agata is at the Pentagon. So, Charlie, tell us more about Signal here. This is the text messaging app the national security team was using.
Yeah, so Signal is a messaging app similar to WhatsApp, but officials tell me the rules are black and white. It is strictly forbidden to share classified information like this on an unclassified system like Signal. There are specific secure systems and specific devices for sharing classified information.
Charlie, they talked about a target package. What is a target package?
Yeah, John, it's essentially what to hit in what order. Sending out warplanes, including the precise timings of airstrikes and the targets they're hitting, puts aircraft and pilots in danger. The United States doesn't want adversaries to know when it's coming and exact locations of the target list. The Houthis do have a missile force and have shot down American drones.
James, I want to talk to you about this story that is, I think, justifiably rocking Washington today and all those in the national security intelligence community circle.
Right.
The Atlantic magazine, under Jeff Goldberg's byline, published a story saying that he was inadvertently included on what can only be described as a text chain on Signal, which is a non-secure commercial app. It has some security, some encryption, but it's commercial. It's not security. It's certainly not considered something by the U.S. government suitable for any unclassified and certainly not top secret or classified information. He was inadvertently included in a text chain of all these senior Trump administration national security officials before the raids began in Yemen, describing all of the policy implications thereof. Walk us through this crazy story.
You said it right. My phone has been blowing up all day from people who are active duty U.S. military and active in the U.S. intelligence community. It violates pretty much every protocol that they're taught to go into those roles. Yes. I mean, if you look at just unclassified information, not talking about secret or top secret information, unclassified information, the Defense Department specifically is barred from using third-party apps like Signal, like Telegram. They're not allowed to use even those apps to pass unclassified information. In fact, their memo says, quote, the misuse and mismanagement of mobile apps poses a cybersecurity and operation security risk. Now, that's just unclassified information. When you're talking about Yemen war plans, when you're talking about targets, Houthi targets, you're talking about secret and top secret information. So it really is mind-blowing to every military and intelligence community professional.
And James, in your experience, you know of situations in which junior grade, either enlisted men or junior officers, did something far less worse and got the book thrown at them.
They've been court-martialed for less. I know of a sailor who took pictures on a submarine, and those pictures he was trying to send to his family. He was reprimanded for that, and I believe was sent to court-martial. I know of another court-martial of a major who he sent a warning to Afghanistan, but he sent classified information over his Gmail account versus his SIPR account, his secret email account that he was supposed to use, and he was reprimanded. And I'm not sure if that went to court-martial, but again, lesser instances of what we're seeing here today.
Robert, I want to read to you a statement that came from the National Security Council, because if you read the story, which I urge everyone to do, Jeff Goldberg says for the longest time he thought this was some sort of either disinformation or entrapment, like this wasn't real, and they were trying to get him to say or communicate things that would be embarrassing to him as a reporter. NSC says this: at this time, the messages thread that was reported appears to be authentic, and we are reviewing how an inadvertent number was added to the chain. That's a confession that happened. This is real. And what Jeff Goldberg saw, conversations between the vice president, national security advisor, secretary of state, and others, or their designees, was legit and visible through a reporter when it never should have been.
At this point, it's all up to President Trump in terms of how this is going to proceed, because Republicans control the House and control the Senate. There seems to be, at this moment, this early hour at least in this story, no sincere interest from Republicans on Capitol Hill to start mounting a formal investigation, though you have seen some exasperation in at least the initial flurry of comments from some Republicans. But if President Trump decides to drive this forward and perhaps dismiss somebody involved in this entire exchange, whether it's a staffer or even a principal, the story will have legs, and it could have legs as an investigation. But at this point, President Trump has so much executive power, and he seems to be, based on my latest round of calls, standing by those involved.
And Robert, from a purely political perspective, there was lots of dialogue during the 23 and 2024 years about classified documents, the handling thereof, the sensitivity around that. Lots of Republicans are on the record saying you got to be careful.
That's true. President Biden's records got scrutiny. Of course, President Trump's records got scrutiny and were under federal investigation.
But his defense was, I was president, and under the Presidential Records Act, I had a kind of immunity. That doesn't exist for any of these other people.
And this report by Jeff Goldberg in The Atlantic raises further questions about, is Signal, this encrypted messaging application, something that's used for other conversations within the administration that are not necessarily going to be documented? Presidential records, and you would guess those in the cabinet, at least to a certain extent, are supposed to be properly documented outside of messaging apps. And this has been an issue going back not just to 2020, but to 2016, when Secretary Clinton's use of a private email server became a political issue in the final months of that campaign. This is going to be a lingering problem for national security officials in the coming years. Secure apps as Jim knows, these are such a prevalent thing in the intelligence community. But just how far should these top officials go? That's a real question.
Right.
Please.
Well, what I was going to say is this comes in the wake, this report out today comes in the wake of just last week and just this month of the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, of the Pentagon saying, if we find that you're talking to journalists, if we think that you're leaking, we're going to polygraph you. We're going to investigate you. And, you know, I heard from people today that that's almost laughable at this point, because of what they were doing. And so, but comes at a time when professionals in the Defense Department, professionals in the intelligence community are on notice from their own government saying, if we find that you're talking to journalists, if we suspect you of leaking, you're going to be polygraphed. And when when professionals are suspected of perhaps leaking something that is something the administration might not like.
Mm-hmm. So in that case, if someone was polygraphed and prosecuted, they might reasonably point to this and say, wait a minute, what are you doing with me?
Right.
How about that over there? This is selective prosecution. At minimum, that could be an argument they could put on their behalf in court.
It's definitely a defense, yes.
That's right.
At the White House Monday, President Trump was asked for his reaction to the report, which seemed to take him by surprise.
I don't know anything about it. I'm not a big fan of The Atlantic. To me, it's a magazine that's going out of business. I don't know anything about it. You're telling me about it for the first time.
Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who just arrived in Hawaii Monday to kick off his first Indo-Pacific trip, had this to say about the report.
I've heard I was characterized. Nobody was texting war plans, and that's all I have to say about that. Thank you.
CBS News White House reporter Olivia Rinaldi joins us now. Olivia, what do we know about the sensitive information divulged in this group chat?
Well, Lindsay, what an extraordinary report there from Jeffrey Goldberg at The Atlantic about this group chat in Signal that he was a part of that included not only him, but also the Vice President, the Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Advisor talking in real time about the potential strikes that they're going to take in Yemen against Houthi rebels. Not only were they discussing, at length the target themselves, but also talking about the timeline, whether or not they should delay them for another month. We also saw in this group chat and some of the details of it that were published by Jeffrey Goldberg, essentially a debate going on between the Vice President and the Secretary of Defense about delaying these strikes for another month to allow for Europe to perhaps take a better or more advanced role in their own security in the region. Vice President J.D. Vance noted that Europe has about 40% of their trade go through the Suez Canal, whereas the U.S. only has 3%, and therefore it would be incumbent upon them to take more of a step in negotiations and in these national security strikes against the Houthi rebels. Some of these texts were even published as a part of this article. We also know that as a part of these discussions that Jeffrey Goldberg had witnessed in this article, they also talked about targets, the weapons they were using, and the attack sequencing. Now, these are things you obviously do not want to get out before you conduct any airstrikes against any, people who are not allies of the United States, but it's quite notable that he was in this group chat commercial application Signal where they were having these sorts of discussions.
I want to ask you about that in a second, but what's the latest we're hearing from the White House about this?
Well, we are just hearing from the White House now from Caroline Leavitt, the press secretary of the White House, where she said that they still have full confidence in Trump's national security team. And that also includes National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, who was the individual who actually asked Goldberg to join the chat, perhaps unbeknownst to them that this was a journalist and not someone within the national security apparatus that they wanted in this group chat. Trump there, you heard a little bit earlier, saying he was not aware of the Atlantic article. And he went on to say after that that the leak couldn't have been very effective because the attack was effective. Then he also admonished the Atlantic by saying they're going out of business and they're not much of a magazine. All of this to say, though, that this is still, if unintentional, a very, very big breach of security.
What are the bigger implications of this, especially with sensitive conversations taking place outside of normal channels, right, Olivia?
Well, there's certainly conversations to be had about the discussion of how classified information is handled in this government. And that's been a conversation that's been ongoing, not only under this administration, but the previous administration and during Trump's own administration, his first administration. So there's certainly a conversation about that and the handling of classified materials that has been ongoing. I suspect that more conversations will be raised specifically as a result of this particular leak. But really, next steps as far as what could be done specifically about this. Look, Trump has said he still has full confidence in his national security team, including Waltz. But there's also Congress. Congressional Republicans could launch any sort of investigation into how this happened and how much information beyond just war plans are being shared on a commercial messaging app like Signal. By all means, it doesn't seem like that's something they're willing to do right now. We've heard from several congressional Republicans throughout the day who expressed surprise, but not exactly a mobilization effort to really do anything to reprimand the people who were involved in this specifically. So as of right now, it just seems like this is a story that's going to keep ricocheting around Washington. We'll have to see if there's actually any impact that will happen to the national security apparatus, but also to Trump's national security team as a result.
CBS News congressional correspondent Nicole Killian joins us now for more on Capitol Hill. So, Nicole, we're going to talk about that in a second. Well, Chuck Schumer and actually House Majority Leader Mike Johnson weighed in on this earlier. Let's listen.
If these detailed exchanges about coordinating military operations fell into the hands of America's enemies, it could get people killed. This debacle requires a full investigation into how this happened, the damage it created, and how we can avoid it in the future.
Should Mike Waltz and Hegseth be disciplined?
No.
How are other lawmakers reacting?
Well, shortly after Speaker Mike Johnson weighed in there saying that he felt that this was just a mistake and that it didn't ultimately compromise safety, in his view that the mission ended up being successful, I did ask House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries if he felt that a congressional investigation should be launched. Take a listen to his response.
There should absolutely be a congressional investigation so that we can understand what happened, why did it happen, and how do we prevent this type of national security breach from ever happening again. This is reckless, irresponsible, and dangerous.
So that is what we were hearing writ large from a number of congressional Democrats who do feel that this matter should be probed further, who believe this was irresponsible on the part of the Trump cabinet officials who were involved in this Signal chat. But there are some congressional Republicans as well who are expressing concern, particularly in the Senate, saying that they do want to look further into what happened. I would note that there is a Senate hearing tomorrow that is held pretty routinely here that deals with the issue of worldwide threats. But there will be a number of intel leaders here on Capitol Hill, including DNI Director Tulsi Gabbard, who was involved in that Signal chat, as well as the head of the FBI, Kash Patel. So it's possible this issue could be raised in tomorrow's hearing.